This is the pass where men became more than men, where the clash of iron still echoes across 25 centuries, where 300 bodies built a wall stronger than stone and bought freedom with their blood. The morning air was heavy, hot and still. From the cliffs above the Malian Gulf, the sea stretched like hammered bronze beneath the rising sun. Yet its calm surface was a lie. Beyond the horizon, the ships of Persia darkened the waters, hull after hull, sails snapping, oars carving the sea in rhythm like the heartbeat of an empire. Inland, the narrow pass of Thermopylae lay waiting. The Greeks called it the Hot Gates, a corridor of stone pressed between mountain and sea. A place where numbers meant nothing, where the earth itself demanded courage as the only currency. Dust rose first. Then came the faint metallic rattle, the deep cadence of marching feet. Persia's army had arrived. To the east, banners rippled like a forest in motion, marked with the symbols of provinces stretching from the Indus to the Nile. The smell of oil, sweat, and horsehide drifted ahead of them, heavy as smoke. And yet, in the narrowest throat of the pass, the defenders stood unshaken. Bronze helmets flashed in the morning light. Crimson cloaks whispered in the breeze. Spears angled forward as one. A forest of steel braced for the storm. 300 Spartans, and with them, allies from across Greece, no more than 7,000 in all. Against them, an empire. The contrast was impossible. One side carried the weight of continents, the other, nothing but resolve. Yet the line of Greeks did not tremble. They had not come to survive. They had come to stand. The silence before the charge was broken only by the sea wind and the scrape of iron against shield. A few last prayers whispered into the dust. Memories of wives, children, homes already gone. Then the order came. Shields locked, spears lowered. When the first wave of Persians thundered into the pass, the ground itself seemed to shudder. Bronze rang against iron, flesh against steel, and the hot gates became a furnace. Men screamed. Arrows blackened the sky. Spears splintered. The defile was consumed by blood and dust. Each heartbeat bought at a terrible price. In that instant, Thermopylae ceased to be a battlefield. It became a threshold, a gate between empire and freedom, conquest and defiance, men and eternity. The story of the 300 is often buried in legend, polished into myth, but strip away the romance, and what remains is no less extraordinary. This was not the tale of gods. It was the tale of men, their politics, their fears, their ambitions, and their resolve. To understand why 300 Spartans stood here, why Greece staked its fragile hopes on an impossible defense, and why Persia demanded their annihilation, we must go back. Back to the years before the hot gates closed. Back to a world where empires were rising, city-states were fracturing, and the storm of war was already on the horizon. Because Thermopylae was not the beginning, it was the reckoning. Before the sea boiled with oars and the mountains shook with marching feet, the world itself was changing, and one man's hunger for empire was about to set it aflame.
The world before Thermopylae was a world divided. To the east, Persia stretched like a shadow across the earth. Its borders swallowed nations, rivers, mountains, and deserts, bending them all to the will of a single throne, the throne of the great king. From Babylon's ziggurats to the palaces of Persepolis, from the satrapies of Egypt to the highlands of Anatolia, the empire of Persia was a machine of conquest. It was the richest, most formidable power the ancient world had ever known. And above it stood Xerxes, son of Darius, heir to a dream of dominion. Where his father had failed to subjugate Greece at Marathon, Xerxes swore he would succeed. His will was iron, and his ambition, boundless. To him, Greece was not just a frontier. It was an insult. A cluster of quarrelsome city-states who had dared defy the command of Persia. For that defiance, he promised annihilation. But to the west, the Greek world was no empire. It was a patchwork of rival cities, each jealous of its independence, each bound by its own customs and pride. Athens, restless and ambitious, was rising on the currents of democracy and naval power. Sparta, austere and disciplined, was hardened into a machine of warriors unlike any the world had seen. Corinth, Thebes, Argos, each had their own ambitions, alliances, and grudges. These were not brothers in arms. They were rivals, often enemies, bound more by rivalry than unity. Yet now, facing the vastness of Persia, their survival depended on something unnatural to the Greek spirit: cooperation. For the common farmer in Attica, for the shepherd in Arcadia, for the potter in Corinth, life continued as it had for centuries. Olives were pressed. Markets bustled. Children played in courtyards. The shadow of empire was distant, until the news began to spread. Scouts returning with stories of Persian armies moving like rivers of men. Messengers whispering of ships so numerous they turned the sea black. And then the envoys of Persia themselves, demanding what they always demanded: earth and water, tokens of submission to the great king. Some cities bowed. Others wavered. But in Sparta, the answer was steel. The Persian messengers were hurled into wells with the taunt, "Dig it out for yourselves." For the Spartans, there could be no submission. For Athens, scarred by Marathon yet restless with pride, there could be no surrender. Still, the divisions ran deep. Greece was no united nation, but a fragile coalition, one spark away from collapse. And Persia knew it. To Xerxes, this campaign was not just war, it was theater. He would march with such overwhelming force that the Greeks would scatter without a fight. And so, as the spring of 480 BCE dawned, the world tilted toward confrontation. In Susa, the royal court glittered with preparations for invasion. Gold and tribute flowed in from satraps across the empire. Armies were summoned from as far as India and Scythia. War elephants were harnessed, cavalry assembled, bridges of boats stretched across the Hellespont. An army was being forged that would dwarf all that had come before. In Greece, by contrast, whispers filled the air. Could the Spartans truly be trusted to lead? Would Athens sacrifice its fleet for cities beyond its borders? Would Thebes fight for Greece, or for Persia? The air was thick with suspicion, but beneath it all, one truth loomed: if Greece did not stand together, it would not stand at all. And so, against their very nature, the city-states formed a fragile league. They would meet Persia not as scattered rivals, but as allies, wary, divided, and mistrustful, but bound by necessity. The world before Thermopylae was not yet aflame, but the kindling was set. Xerxes' armies had begun to move. Greek envoys were riding from city to city, begging for unity. Farmers in Boeotia began burying their grain. Fishermen in the Gulf hauled in their nets and looked to the horizon with unease. The storm was gathering. And in the heart of Sparta, one man prepared himself and his warriors for what lay ahead. A king named Leonidas, who knew that soon, at the narrow pass of the Hot Gates, his name would be carved forever into history. But wars are not born in silence. They are born in sparks, in insults, assassinations, betrayals, and blood. And for Greece and Persia, the spark had already been struck. Wars are not born in silence. They begin in whispers, in insults, in sparks of defiance that set the world ablaze. For Greece and Persia, that spark was struck at Marathon. In 490 BCE, Darius, father of Xerxes, sent his armies across the Aegean to punish Athens for daring to support the Ionian revolt. Athens had defied the empire. And for that defiance, the great king promised fire and ruin. But on the plain of Marathon, Persia tasted humiliation. Farmers and craftsmen turned hoplites had charged across the earth and hurled the invaders back into the sea. Darius swore revenge, but death came before he could take it. The duty passed to his son, to Xerxes. For Xerxes, Greece was not just a frontier. It was an insult. His father's defeat had stained the throne of Persia. To cleanse that stain, he would not simply conquer Greece, he would erase it. And so, the great king prepared. Bridges of boats were lashed across the Hellespont, binding Asia to Europe. A canal was carved through Mount Athos so his ships would not risk the storms that had wrecked Darius' fleet. Armies were raised from every corner of the empire: Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Scythians. Herodotus would later say they were countless, that rivers ran dry as they marched. The truth was terrifying enough, perhaps 200,000 men, perhaps more. A living tide rolling westward. Xerxes himself watched from his throne of gold. When storms destroyed his bridges, he lashed out not at men, but at nature. He ordered the sea itself whipped and chained, cursed like a rebellious servant. This was no ordinary king. This was a man who believed the world itself must obey him. As Persia armed itself, envoys spread ahead with a simple demand: earth and water. Symbols of submission. Many cities bent the knee. But not all. In Athens, the people remembered Marathon. They swore never to kneel. In Sparta, the messengers did not leave alive. Hurled into a well, the Spartans gave them their answer: if you want earth and water, dig it out for yourselves. It was defiance. And Persia took note. Yet Greece was still divided. Thebes leaned toward Persia. Argos hesitated, jealous of Sparta. Many cities cared only for their own borders. Some whispered that survival lay not in fighting, but in bowing. Still, Athens and Sparta held firm. At Corinth, the city-states gathered, enemies forced to sit as allies. Sparta would lead the army. Athens, the fleet. It was a fragile alliance, stitched with mistrust, but it was all Greece had. And Greece would need everything. For Xerxes' invasion was not war alone. It was spectacle, a display of such overwhelming force that resistance would seem hopeless. In Athens, the oracle at Delphi gave dark words: your wooden walls alone shall stand, to save you and your children. Some believed it meant palisades. Others saw the warning in their fleet. Themistocles, cunning and relentless, argued for the ships. Athens listened. Families were evacuated. Women and children fled. The city would stake its survival on the sea. In Sparta, the elders turned to their kings. Leonidas was chosen. A man steady, pragmatic, unflinching. But Sparta faced a dilemma. The invasion came during the festival of Carnea. Religious law forbade the full army from marching. Leonidas found a grim solution. He would take only 300, his personal guard. Each man selected for one reason: he had already fathered a son. The bloodline would survive, even if the man did not. The mission was not to win. It was to delay. To bleed the Persians. To hold long enough for the fleet to strike at sea, and for the fragile Greek alliance to harden into unity. And so, as the great king's armies marched, so too did Leonidas. 300 Spartans, joined by thousands of allies, moving north to the hot gates. The spark had become fire. Persia was coming. Greece was bracing. And the narrow pass of Thermopylae waited, the place where courage and cruelty would soon collide. And when the first blows were struck, the world saw what happens when resolve meets an empire. For the hot gates were about to be tested in fire. The march north was long and unforgiving. Through mountain valleys and dusty roads, Leonidas led his 300 Spartans, joined by allies from across Greece: Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, Phocians. In all, perhaps 7,000 men. To meet the largest army the world had ever seen. They marched not as conquerors, but as a wall. A wall meant to break an empire. The pass of Thermopylae awaited them, narrow, jagged, hemmed in by the sea on one side and mountains on the other. At its tightest, barely wide enough for a chariot to pass. To Leonidas, it was the only place where numbers could be leveled, where courage could weigh more than multitudes. When the Greeks arrived, they set to work. They repaired the ancient wall across the pass, stacking stone, fortifying earth, preparing the choke point where Persia would break or bleed them dry. Camps were set, fires lit, shields polished for war. Then came the sound. From the north, the ground began to tremble. The dust cloud rose first, a haze across the horizon. Then the banners. Then the endless tramp of men. Persia had arrived. Herodotus tells us Xerxes' host was so vast it seemed without end, a river of men and horses flowing through the land. They camped on the plain, stretching beyond sight. Campfires lit the night sky like a second constellation. The Greeks looked upon the sea of tents and felt the weight of inevitability. And yet, Leonidas stood calm. To his men, he gave no false hope. He reminded them why they had come, not to survive, but to hold. For 4 days, Xerxes waited, expecting the Greeks to scatter. To him, the sight of a few thousand men defying an empire was absurd. He sent envoys demanding surrender. The offer: lay down arms, live as subjects of Persia. Leonidas' answer was a phrase carved forever into history. Molon laid. Come and take them. The insult stung the great king. He could wait no longer. He unleashed his first wave. The Medes and Scythians surged forward, spears flashing, arrows whistling, war cries tearing through the air. They poured into the narrow throat of the pass, expecting the Greeks to crumble. Instead, they met a wall of bronze. The Spartans fought in silence, shields locked, spears thrusting in rhythm. Each man covered the man to his left, each strike a calculated rhythm of death. The narrow ground robbed the Persians of their advantage. Their numbers became a curse. Pressed tight, unable to outflank, they fell in heaps before the Greek line. The dust filled with screams, the earth slick with blood. The pass became a slaughterhouse. Wave after wave broke against the phalanx. The Spartans advanced, not in chaos, but in discipline, their formation a machine of war. By midday, the Medes had failed. By dusk, the Immortals, Persia's elite guard, had been hurled back as well. Xerxes, watching from his throne, was stunned. His men, called immortal for their endless replacements, had been bloodied by a few thousand Greeks. But still, he believed it temporary. He had numbers. He had time. And he would spend both. The next day, the assault came again. Arrows rained so thick the sky darkened. The Greeks raised their shields, the bronze ringing under the hail. When the Persians closed, the Spartans drove them back once more. Spears splintered, swords flashed, and the hot gates grew slick with death. The Persians dragged away their dead by night, but the Greeks left theirs upon the field, not hidden, but displayed, proof of their defiance. Day after day, the pattern repeated. Assault after assault. Xerxes grew enraged. His generals pleaded. His soldiers began to fear the narrow pass where death waited in silence. The Greeks mocked them, feigning retreats to lure them in, then turning with sudden ferocity. Even the sea conspired, storms wrecked Persian ships off the coast, thinning his fleet. Still, the Greeks endured. Still, the Spartans stood. But courage has its limits, and even stone can be broken. The Persians were bleeding, but not beaten. And soon, betrayal would enter the pass. And then, in the shadow of the mountains, a traitor appeared. A man whose treachery would open a hidden path, and change the fate of the hot gates forever. The third dawn rose red over Thermopylae. The air stank of sweat, smoke, and rot. The sea wind carried the cries of the wounded. The pass itself was choked with corpses, Persian and Greek alike, piled in the dust where they had fought and fallen. For 2 days, the Greeks had held. For 2 days, they had turned back the tide of empire, proving that discipline and courage could defy overwhelming numbers. But Xerxes was not finished. And in the darkness of the mountains, betrayal was already moving. His name was Ephialtes. A Greek from Malice, he knew the land, the hidden goat paths winding above the hot gates. For silver, for envy, or perhaps for fear, he chose treachery. He sold his people and his name for all eternity, leading the Persians along the trail that would outflank Leonidas and crush the defenders in a vice. Xerxes seized the chance. He sent his immortals, 10,000 strong, to follow Ephialtes under cover of night. Their torches flickered against the cliffs as they climbed, sandals grinding stone. At the top, the Phocians, Greeks assigned to guard the path, were taken by surprise. Some resisted, others fled. The immortals swept past. The trap was sprung. At dawn, word reached Leonidas. The Persians had circled. The pass was lost. For the allies, the choice was clear: retreat or die. Many withdrew to fight another day. But Leonidas knew his fate. To retreat was to abandon the stand, to betray the message Sparta had sworn to deliver. He chose death. And his 300 chose it with him. So too did 700 Thespians, refusing to leave. And 400 Thebans, compelled by Spartan command. Fewer than 2,000 men stood to face the empire alone. The final day began in silence. The Spartans rose, combed their long hair, polished their armor, and prepared their bodies as if for festival. They prayed to their gods. They looked to one another, not as men seeking victory, but as brothers walking together into eternity. Then, with a shout that rolled against the cliffs, they charged. The Persians reeled at the ferocity. Spears thrust, swords slashed, shields battered. The Greeks fought with the desperation of men already dead. They drove the enemy back from the wall, into the dust, into the sea itself. The narrow pass became a furnace, the earth trembling under the clash of iron and the cries of the dying. But the end was inevitable. Their spears splintered. They drew their short swords. When those shattered, they fought with blades, with fists, even with teeth. Leonidas fell in the crush, pierced by arrows, his body trampled in the dust. Yet even in death, he was a beacon. His men fought like wolves to reclaim him, 3 times hurling the Persians back, 3 times dragging his corpse from enemy hands. Only when they too were cut down did the Persians seize him at last. By noon, the survivors had been driven to a hillock at the heart of the pass. There, shoulder to shoulder, they made their final stand. Arrows blotted out the sun. Spears pierced shield and flesh alike. The cries of the living mingled with the silence of the dead. It was slaughter. But it was also legend. The Persians scoured the field, stripping armor, severing heads. They raised the head of Leonidas on a spear as a warning. But the message was not what Xerxes intended. For Greece, the sight of that mutilated king was not terror, it was fire. His defiance would not be buried in the dust. It would spread like flame across the cities of Greece. The soil of Thermopylae drank their blood, and carried their defiance. Yet even in death, the Spartans had bought what they sought, time. And with it, the tide of war was about to turn. The smoke still rose over Thermopylae when the news spread. Across Greece, whispers of the slaughter became thunder. Leonidas was dead. The Spartans were gone. The hot gates had fallen. Yet what seemed, at first, a defeat was something more. The 300 had given Greece what it needed most, time. Time to rally, to prepare, to harden its resolve. And with that time, the war began to shift. Xerxes marched south. His army poured into Greece like a flood. Cities fell. Villages burned. The road to Athens lay open. The Athenians, already braced for this, abandoned their homes. Women and children fled across the sea to Salamis and Troezen. The city itself was left nearly empty. When the Persians arrived, they found only ruins waiting. The temples of the Acropolis were put to the torch. Statues toppled. Marble blackened with fire. Athens burned, but her spirit did not. At sea, the fate of the war would now be decided. The Persian navy, vast and glittering, stretched across the Aegean. Triremes from Phoenicia, Egypt, and Ionia formed its ranks. To Xerxes, it was unbreakable. To Themistocles of Athens, it was vulnerable. Themistocles was cunning, subtle, patient. He knew the Persians trusted their numbers. He knew their size was also their weakness. And he knew the narrow straits of Salamis could turn the tide as surely as the pass at Thermopylae. The Greeks debated fiercely. Many urged retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth, abandoning the islands to their fate. But Themistocles held his ground. He sent secret messengers to Xerxes, pretending to betray his allies, urging him to attack at once in the straits. Xerxes, prideful and eager for the kill, seized the bait. His navy surged forward, cramming into the narrow waters. There, the Greeks waited. Fewer in number, but lighter, faster, trained for the tight turns of coastal battle. As the Persians struggled in the bottleneck, their ships colliding in chaos, the Greeks struck. Greek rams punched holes through Persian hulls. Wood cracked, oars shattered, men flailed in the water as the sea turned black with debris and red with blood. Drowning soldiers screamed as the bronze-tipped prows smashed again and again. From the shore, Xerxes watched his fleet unravel. From his golden throne, he saw the sea consume his ships, and with them, his dream of empire. He fled back to Asia, leaving his general, Mardonius, to finish what he no longer could. Salamis was the answer to Thermopylae. On land, the Greeks had bled. At sea, they struck. One was sacrifice, the other survival. Together, they forged the turning of the war. If Athens commanded the sea, it was Sparta that would decide the war on land. The following year, at Plataea, Spartan discipline and Athenian resolve stood side by side. Mardonius led the Persians, confident that numbers would prevail. But the Greeks met him with ferocity. At Plataea, the Greeks crushed his forces in brutal hand-to-hand slaughter. Spears and swords cut through Persian ranks, and Mardonius himself fell in the dust, his body left where it lay as his army dissolved into panic and retreat. The tide had turned. What began as conquest ended as collapse. The death of Leonidas and his men had not been in vain. Their stand at Thermopylae bought the time for Salamis. Their sacrifice lit the fire that burned at Plataea. Their blood was not wasted. It was the ink that wrote the first chapter of freedom, a chapter the world still reads. But victory carried its own price. Cities lay in ashes, thousands lay dead, and even as the Persians retreated, Greece itself teetered on the edge of collapse. Victory came, but it came drenched in ashes. The Persian retreat did not erase the wounds they left behind. Across Greece, the war had carved scars into earth and flesh alike. Cities still smoked from the fires Xerxes had lit. The countryside was stripped bare, fields blackened, orchards axed, grain stores plundered. Rivers ran foul with corpses. The living walked among ruins, searching for kin who would never return. Athens, the heart of Greece, lay in silence. Its temples were toppled, its sacred Acropolis reduced to charred stone. Families who had fled to the islands now returned to find only rubble where homes once stood. Mothers wept in the streets, clutching ash and broken beams. Children wandered with hollow eyes. The price of defiance had been devastation. Even Sparta, proud in its discipline, mourned. The names of Leonidas and his 300 were spoken like prayers, but the grief was no less heavy for being wrapped in glory. Wives wore mourning veils. Sons were raised fatherless. For every Spartan who fell, a household sat in silence. The war had shattered more than walls. It had tested the fragile unity of Greece. Old rivalries stirred again. Thebes, stained by suspicion of Persian sympathy, found itself isolated. Corinth muttered about Athenian ambition. Argos seethed at Sparta's rising prestige. The alliance that had stood at Salamis and Plataea now threatened to unravel in the smoke of victory. And yet, in that moment of collapse, something deeper held. Greece had seen the storm. It had felt the fire. And it had survived. But survival was not triumph. The human cost was immense. Starvation stalked the land. Armies bled their treasuries dry. Farmers returned to find their fields trampled by hoof and shield. Survivors bore scars of fire and iron. For many, the gods themselves seemed silent, their temples blackened, their statues shattered. Among the Persians, too, collapse echoed. Xerxes, humiliated, returned to Susa. The empire still spanned continents, still commanded wealth and armies. But the aura of invincibility was gone. The great king had lashed the sea, whipped rivers, bridged continents, and still he had been defied by a handful of quarrelsome cities. For the first time, Persia knew the taste of limits. For Greece, collapse was paradox. On one hand, fields burned and homes destroyed. On the other, a seed had been planted, a seed watered by the blood at Thermopylae, fed by the fire at Salamis, and rooted in the earth at Plataea. The seed of something fragile, something dangerous, something that could one day rise into empire of its own, unity. But in the aftermath of war, the Greeks could not see that future. They saw only the wreckage. They saw the ruins of Athens, the weeping widows of Sparta, the scars of fire across their land. Victory had come. But it had come at a price so steep that many wondered if it had been victory at all. And yet, from those ashes, a new world would emerge. The toll of Thermopylae and Salamis would echo far beyond Greece, reshaping empires, memory, and the very idea of freedom itself. When the smoke cleared, Greece was changed forever. The Persian invasion had been broken, its armies driven back across the Aegean. The greatest empire on earth had struck with overwhelming force, and failed. But the price of that failure was written in blood, fire, and grief. Thermopylae became the first wound remembered. There, the names of Leonidas and his 300 were etched into stone. A monument was raised upon the hill where the last survivors fell. Upon it, an epitaph carved in simple words. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. No gilded speech, no boast of glory, only the calm acceptance of duty. For the Greeks, it became scripture. For Persia, it was a warning. For centuries to come, the stones of Thermopylae would speak louder than any king. Athens, though scarred, refused to bow. From its ruins it began to rise again, prouder, defiant. Its navy, blooded at Salamis, became the foundation of power. In time, the Parthenon would crown its Acropolis, marble gleaming in defiance of the blackened ruins Xerxes had left behind. Sparta, though it had lost its king and warriors, emerged with its legend sealed. The sacrifice at Thermopylae became its identity, its creed. In Sparta, mothers told their sons to remember Leonidas. Fathers taught that courage was not survival, it was enduring one day longer than the world believed possible. But war left wounds deeper than monuments. Thebes, tainted by its tilt toward Persia, carried a wound of mistrust that would never heal. Corinth muttered at Athens' ambition. Old rivalries flickered beneath the surface, even as the ruins still smoked. And yet, something new had been born. For the first time, Greece had acted as one. Athens at sea, Sparta on land, rivals who had set aside hatred when the storm demanded it. That fragile unity planted an idea, that free cities, fiercely independent, could stand together against empire. Persia, though defeated, endured. Its empire still stretched across continents, its kings still ruled, its satrapies still paid tribute. but it had been stopped. And in that stopping, the first fracture had appeared. In the quiet years that followed, memory did what swords could not. Thermopylae was told and retold, carried in song, carved in stone, whispered in the training grounds of new warriors. It became not just history, but myth. And myth, once born, does not die. The aftermath of Thermopylae was not peace. It was reckoning. The Greeks had paid in blood. But in that blood, they discovered something no empire could erase, that freedom, once defended, speaks louder than conquest. But Thermopylae was more than memory. It became a lesson, about ambition, cruelty, survival, and what men are willing to give when nothing else remains. Thermopylae did not end in ashes. It lived on. In stone, in story, and in the very language of courage. For Greece, it was the spark of something new. Out of the smoke of war rose an age of philosophy, democracy, and art. Athens rebuilt, Sparta endured, and together their defiance marked the dawn of classical Greece, a civilization whose ideas would ripple through Rome, through Europe, through the modern world. For Persia, it was the first crack in a wall that once seemed unbreakable. The empire remained vast, its kings still powerful, its satrapies still obedient. But the illusion of invincibility had been shattered. No longer could Persia claim the world would kneel without question. From Thermopylae onward, resistance was possible. For humanity, it was a lesson carved into eternity. That even the most overwhelming force can be resisted. That even defeat can become victory, if it inspires those who come after. That freedom, though fragile, is worth blood, sacrifice, and remembrance. The 300 became more than soldiers. They became the measure of defiance itself. A symbol for every hopeless stand. For every people who faced impossible odds. For every generation that asked what it means to give everything for a cause greater than themselves. Centuries later, their name would be invoked by nations on the brink of collapse, by leaders rallying the broken, by soldiers holding the line when retreat was the easier choice. Thermopylae became shorthand for defiance, proof that the human spirit could outlast empires. The stones at the hot gates still stand. The sea has retreated, the cliffs have shifted, but the past still whispers of blood and steel. And the epitaph remains, carved in words that carry across centuries. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Thermopylae is not myth. It is memory. And memory, once born, does not die. If Thermopylae was the gate where freedom was bought with blood, then what followed was the age it opened, an age of empires, philosophers, and wars that still shape us today. Subscribe, because the next story will leave you speechless.